Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel, or if you are new, my name is Orlagh. So I'm going to start off this video by saying that from here on out there will be spoilers about the haunting of Bly Manor. So if you've not seen it yet, or if you're really spoiler averse, maybe come and check this video out after you've watched it. And also a few trigger warnings. I'll be talking about a lot of themes throughout Bly Manor, which include and are not limited to death, emotional abuse in relationships, child abuse, all sorts of things. So if you have any of those kind of sensitivities, again, maybe give this one a miss. I want to preface this by saying I'm a huge horror fan and I've seen more horror films than I probably can even remember. If you can't tell by my cool Guess Who t-shirt, it's my favourite genre of film to watch, and The Haunting of Hill House was one of my favourite, if not my favourite, series of all time. So when I found out they were doing The Haunting of Bly Manor, my standards were very high, to say the least. I was really excited, and because of that I avoided any spoilers going in, which in hindsight was maybe a bit of a mistake, because from what I've read afterwards, they actually tried to market this as more of a kind of gothic romance as opposed to a straight up horror. But because the word haunting is in the title, I did expect a couple more scares. So this video is going to be broken down into 3 sections. I'm going to do 1, the pros and what I loved about this series, 2, the cons, and 3, I'm going to try my best to answer some frequently asked questions, or maybe some plot holes that people have been talking about a lot online. So just stay tuned for that. It kind of looks like my eucalyptus is growing out of my head, May Queen style, but we'll roll with it. Okay, it has to be said that just like The Haunting of Hill House, this series was shot beautifully. The set design, the costumes, just the way they filmed everything just looks beautiful, and you can tell they obviously had quite a high budget for it. Every episode does feel like its own little mini film, which I thought was really great. The acting throughout I thought was really good. My favourite was definitely Tania Miller, who plays Mrs. Gross, or Miss Gross. I thought she was brilliant. I've seen her previously in Years and Years, which is another great series if you've not already checked that out. And of course we have Victoria Pedretti, who comes back as Dani, who is the American au pair who comes over to look after Flora and Miles. I loved the different elements of romance that you could find throughout this series. So like The Haunting of Hill House, it isn't just a straight up horror, although I'll talk a bit more about my criticisms of that later, but you had many romantic elements, and at the end of the show that's what Flora, when she's grown up, actually says. This is more a story about love as opposed to horror. But whether you had the emotional manipulation in relationships or the intermarital affairs that were happening both with Viola and her husband in the past and her sister, or in the more present day when you have the affairs between the children's parents and the brother-in-law, which was all that complicated mess. I think they did a good job of showing romance in general, but my favourite, obviously, it had to be the relationship between American girl Dani and good old northerner Jamie the gardener. Their romantic arch really made this series for me, to be honest. I think it was so beautiful. The last 2 episodes had me absolutely crying in buckets. I thought it was so emotional. I thought the way they built on it was really good, and I really enjoyed that element. I think the kid actors were also good. That's often a problem when you have young child actors and things. They both did a really good job. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, the British accents really did annoy me. They seemed a little bit too put on, but I know they was trying to get that kind of period element into it. But we'll come back to that in the cons. One quite subtle clue that I noticed throughout, which I thought was really clever, you could start to tell more about the situation depending on what clothes the children or the adults were wearing. Don't quote me on this, but I think nearly every time Flora was tucked away, she was wearing her pink onesie. When you think about Rebecca, every time Peter was nearby she was wearing black, whereas in other scenes she was wearing lighter colours. Every time Miles seemed to be possessed by Peter, he was wearing a hat. So I think these kind of costume changes indicating what was going on under the surface were quite clever. And I need to say, Owen the chef, I just want to package him up in a little box and put him on my shoulder, and if I have a bad day, he can just soothe me with delicious recipes. But overall, I really did enjoy this series, and I understand that the criticisms I'm about to give in a minute probably make it sound like I don't, but again, I think because my expectations were so high, and because Hill House is one of my favourite shows of all time, I think it was hard not to compare it to that, to be honest. But overall, I did enjoy it. I'd probably give it like a solid 7 out of 10. I think it was very enjoyable to watch, even though there were some filler episodes. I do think it was a really good show. But moving on to the cons, of which unfortunately there are quite a few. Overall, it wasn't scary, and I think what The Haunting of Hill House did so amazingly well was they wrapped that family dynamic of grief and family into relationships and horror so well, and because they intertwined it so well, it made the scary points even scarier because you really felt for the characters, and it made it difficult because even if some of the ghosts were acting in a malicious way, you felt for them because you knew their backstory and they were part of the family, and it scared me and made me sad in equal measure. Whereas I think in Bly Manor it didn't scare me, it just made me sad. So to me it felt like it was missing like 50% of the element. There were a lot of ghosts in the background, like with Hill House, where you could kind of do a little bit of Where's Wally and try to see where the ghosts were, which was fun, but I do think there was a lot of unexplored elements that they could have done to like flesh out the scary aspect. You know, we had the plague doctor with the creepy mask. He made a couple of appearances, but they really could have embellished on that somewhat. We even see in the flashback episode, which I think was episode 8 or 7, I can't quite remember, there were a lot of plague victims who no doubt died in the house, so they really could have made more of a thing about occasionally showing some of them popping up, because even the people who died of natural causes or from illnesses would still end up in this kind of purgatory, still living their old life, retracing their steps as ghosts, not just the people who the lady in the lake killed. So I do think they could have fleshed that out a bit more. And also I think with the dollhouse, I think they could have used that a bit more, because obviously dolls' houses and children in general are quite creepy, and I think that could have been used a little bit better. So overall, the fact it didn't really scare me. There were a couple of times, like when you first see the lady in the lake, that were quite scary, or especially in the attic when the boy with no face moves in the background. That was kind of creepy, but again, it wasn't really enough to really scare me, whereas the broken neck lady in Hill House haunted me for ages after. So again, it's just hard not to compare it to that. Going back to accents, I think the narrator, absolutely love her as an actor, and I am glad she was back in it. A couple of times her north-south thing did throw me off a little bit. Again, not enough to ruin it at all, but it was something I could pick up on. I know some people had criticisms about Peter Quinn's accent. I mean, I thought it was a great Scottish accent, to be honest, but I'm not Scottish, so what do I know? I found some of the episodes lacked a bit of direction, and again, it's impossible for me to not compare this to Hill House. I think I would have rated this a lot higher if it had been called something completely different and it was a separate entity, but again, it's not, and I do need to bear that in mind. So I think every episode in Hill House kind of added to the overall puzzle, whereas some of these episodes ended up leaving you with more questions than answers, and then maybe necessarily the answers you got weren't that satisfactory. Another con is that I guessed quite early on that Miles was being possessed by Peter Quinn. I think the first or second time we saw Peter Quinn, I quickly caught on that Miles was being possessed, and I also had the feeling quite early on that Miss Gross was actually dead, because they really kind of hammed it down your throat that she wasn't eating. So again, maybe things like that weren't as subtle as they were trying to make out, and again, maybe it's to make every viewer aware of that, but I do like having to solve the puzzle myself sometimes without being force-fed all the information. To summarise, I really did enjoy the show, even though it wasn't without its faults. I thought it was really beautifully done, whether it was aesthetically or down to the plot. I think really what we're meant to take away is that the real horror, apart from jump scares or ghosts in the background, that the real horror is that we all end up dying and fading away in some part, which sounds quite grim, but it is a horror show, and all of the different threads of romance and the idea of fading away, even physically, the ghost's face is faded over time. I think it's the idea that we're all on some level aware of our own mortality, and the idea that when we die, what do we leave? I mean, for Viola, it was the idea that her daughter would be waiting for her, or her massive trunk of jewellery and clothes, but in the end she was still in the bottom of the lake. So I think the main takeaway is how we experience love, which at its best is incredible, but then we can also experience loss and betrayal and manipulation because of love, and how these intertwine in all of the different characters was really interesting to see. So I did enjoy it from that aspect, but for me it wasn't horror. It was horror in terms of the idea of grief is horrible, or the idea of losing somebody you love is also horrible and quite horrific, but it wasn't horror in its true nature. And I think because Hill House, again comparing it, did both of those things so well, I feel like Hill House still comes out on top. I've seen a couple of questions floating around online, some potential plot holes, and I'm going to do my best to give you an idea of what I think the answers are. So the first one is, what happened to Dani's fiancé? How come he dies and never shows up again? I think the ghost of Dani's fiancé wasn't really a ghost in the traditional sense of the meaning. I think it was more like she was being haunted by the memory of him. So he wasn't following her around, looking at her all the time in mirrors and reflective surfaces. It was more the idea of the guilt she carried. She felt so guilty because the fact she called off the wedding, because obviously deep down she was gay or didn't want to get married to him, and she felt very guilty the idea that she had called off the marriage then resulted in his death. So the last time we see his ghost is, I think, the second time after she kisses the gardener, and after that he fades away. So I like to think of it as the guilt she had was like here, and then the love she had for Jamie started to kind of overtake the guilt, and by her coming out to herself she could let go of that guilt and then just carry on with Jamie, and I think that's why he disappeared. So the second frequently asked question is, why did Hannah never question who Viola's footprints belonged to, and how come Viola didn't kill the parents while they lived in the house? So earlier on in the episodes, Hannah actually does say that these footprints only occur a couple of times per year, and if you add to that this is actually a summer house, it's not somewhere they live all year round, I think we can guess that maybe in the cycle of the Lady in the Lake's life, or death I should say, that maybe she only makes a real appearance 2 or 3 times per year. So I think it's quite reasonable to assume that on those occasions, luckily nobody had walked out into her path in the house. And in terms of cleaning up the footprints, I mean, it seems like Hannah truly does believe that the footprints belong to the children, so maybe women's feet were a lot smaller back then, maybe they could have looked like children's footprints. And also when we get into more of the present day, when Dani is the au pair, we have to remember that for that whole time Hannah's dead. She's actually a ghost, so you know, she doesn't know if it's real or if she's being tucked away. So I think she's so confused with everything, she's not likely to question it. Which leads us on to the next question, which is, how could Hannah not even realise she was dead? Well, so in episode 5 we realised that Hannah is actually dead, and this was one of my favourite episodes, when you find out that the cracks she'd been seeing on the wall were representations of the well that she was looking in after Miles, who was possessed by Peter, pushed her into the well. So this links into another question. Yes, that was Miles being possessed when he pushed Hannah into the well. Straight after, he doesn't remember and he looks quite shocked that it's happened, and Peter, I think at this point, is annoyed that she's starting to figure out what's going on around the house. She's meddling quite a lot, so that's his way of sorting out the problem and killing her. So for the whole show as we see it, Hannah is actually a ghost, she is dead, and we are given clues to that. She doesn't eat a lot, she seems confused a lot of the time. When she first meets Dani, she looks like she's kind of confused for a moment. In terms of the fact, why can she still clean, why can she still carry the children, I think maybe because she's not realised she's a ghost yet, which is why all of those things have just continued on as normal. Another commonly asked question was, who was moving the dolls in the doll's house? So if you remember the faceless boy that we see, who was killed because Viola, the Lady in the Lake, thought that he was her child, or just wanted to kill him in general. And we see in one scene that he's playing with the doll's house. So I think after Flora met him in the attic and gave him his new face, Dwight from The Office style, I think that maybe they struck up some kind of friendship, and the ghost boy was actually warning Flora about where the ghosts were in the house, and he would move the dolls around the house in order to give her some kind of information. Again, in my con section I did mention I would have liked that to have been explored a bit more, just because the ideas of like creepy dolls and dolls' houses have always scared me, and I think it's pretty cool, but that would be my explanation for why the dolls move. And the doll of the Lady in the Lake being under the chest of drawers, I'm guessing is supposed to be her under the lake. It's far enough away from the doll's house, which is supposed to be the real manor, and that lets her know that the lady is still in the lake and isn't walking around the house. Another question that seems to be popping up a lot is, why, when Peter went into Miles' body, could he not leave the grounds, but Dani could leave the grounds when Viola was in her? So I think for 2 reasons. One, when Peter tried to leave the grounds originally in Miles's body, he was possessing Miles, but he hadn't fully formed or bonded with him yet. There hadn't been the scene in the attic where Miles basically gives him permission to live in his body forever. So that could be one reason. And 2, I think the more likely of the reason, is because the reason people couldn't leave the grounds was because of Viola, because of her gravity that she'd created that meant that everybody on the grounds who died would stay there forever. So when Dani invites her in, she says you, me, us, and they form a bond together forever. She could leave the grounds because not only were they bonded together, but it was Viola stopping other people leaving the grounds. So for me that was not necessarily a plot hole. I think it was kind of explained quite well in the show, but it seems to be something that was floating about quite a lot. Another question I found quite interesting was, did the lady in the lake kill Peter because he was trying to steal her jewellery? Hannah said that the necklace was 400 years old. So I really like this idea. I do like the idea that the lady in the lake was trying to protect her possessions, because as we know, Peter was trying to steal the jewellery to make some money to escape to America. But in reality, I don't necessarily think that was the case. I think she just killed Peter because Peter was in the way. I don't necessarily think after all those years she has a motive anymore. She doesn't know who she is. She's forgotten all of her memories. She's just become the representation of rage and stubbornness, staying alive all that time. So even though that would be cool, I don't necessarily think that's the case. So this is an interesting one. Why is Viola in a room which is basically inside the treasure chest of her own possessions, and what would have happened if her daughter had opened the chest instead of her sister? So I think the reason why she was in this room full of her own possessions was the fact that she had refused to die, essentially. She refused to be given the last rites. I think it was cancer she probably had. Some people think maybe it was tuberculosis, but I think if it was TB, everyone else in the house would have died too. So I think it's safe to say it was probably lung cancer. And I think that when she put away all of her possessions, she almost created her own casket, and her spirit attached itself to that. If you remember, when she hears the locks in the door opening, which are supposed to be the locks to the treasure trunk, she actually looks really excited. So I think if it was her daughter who had come into the room, she would have maybe turned into quite a harmless ghost. Maybe she would have tried to attach herself to her daughter in some way. I don't think she would have been so rage-filled, but the fact she saw her sister, who she had expressly felt quite paranoid about, she was worried that the sister was going to marry her husband, who in the end we know she did, and that's why she turned really angry and ended up killing her sister. I think if the daughter had have opened the box, she probably wouldn't have been such an angry ghost. I have a question about Rebecca and Flora. Why was Rebecca possessing Flora randomly all the time? What was the point? I understand Peter doing it with Miles so he could smoke cigarettes and control situations, like killing Hannah, but I don't understand why Rebecca would with Flora. So I think with this question, we've got to think of it as they were trying to prep the children for eventually what would be them taking over their bodies forever. So they would possess them from time to time, they would call it being tucked away, and they would put Miles and Flora into these nice memories so they could possess them. And then when they finished possessing them, the children would forget what had ever really happened. And I think the reason why Miles was possessed by Peter was quite clear. As the reader said, he did it to control situations. He did it probably for a little bit of a nicotine fix. He did it so he could kill Hannah. I think the reason why Rebecca did it to Flora was probably one, because Peter told her to. I think she'd followed all of his plan up to this point. She'd forgiven him for letting her drown on her own, because remember, Peter essentially tricked her into dying. She didn't know that he was going to try and murder her, essentially. So I think that's one of the main reasons. She was just kind of following orders. The second one was probably because she wanted to experience a bit of life again. You know, when she died, she didn't realise she was going to die, so she probably feels quite nice inside a body again, which sounds creepy. But ultimately, I think it was to prime them so that they're ready for being tucked away forever eventually when the time came. So leading on to another question, it said, did Rebecca ever even really care for the children? It seems like she didn't after all she'd done. I think she did care for the children. I think she was clearly in a very toxic, emotionally abusive relationship. I think she cared for the children in a manner of ways, but the way we can really see how she's different from Peter is in the end, she decides not to possess Flora, which, you know, is the bare minimum really, isn't it? Not possessing somebody forever. But she decides to trick Peter into thinking she had done it, even knowing that that would mean she'd be potentially trapped forever as a ghost. And she says something along the lines of, it's not that I don't need your help, but it's more help than anyone should ever ask for, because as we know, Peter murdered her essentially, and that was too much to be asked of her. And also at the very end, she does offer to enter and possess Flora's body when the lady in the lake is dragging her down, just so she won't be on her own and she won't feel all of that pain on her own, because again, she was there suffering on her own at the time. So I think it's a bit reductive to say, oh, she just didn't care about them. I think it was quite nuanced, and In the end, she showed her true colours to be that she did care for them. And Peter was probably really annoyed, and, you know, who cares what he thinks. I think it was an interesting way of how this idea of like the cycle of trauma, that just because that had been done to her, she refused to then put it onto somebody else. She broke that cycle and eventually let Flora go free. Why do you think their names were changed? Do you think that it was to give them a fresh start in the US and have no real connection to their previous life? Well, we know at the end that the bride who was sat around listening to this story, who is Flora, said, oh, my middle name is Flora. So I don't think it's a case that their names were changed, because if you remember back to the scene where Owen in his new restaurant is meeting up with Dani and Jamie, and they're all speaking, they reference, or Owen references now, how Flora's 17, she has a boyfriend, and he refers to her as Flora, so obviously she's not had her name changed at that point in the story. I think it's more that when Jamie's retelling the story, she is making up a load of details, because even the dates don't match. She looks a lot older than she should do, considering the age of the character of Jamie in the past. So I think it's more like she's just changing names and dates just so Flora and the people who are listening don't realise she's talking about them. And linking into that, people are saying, why did the children forget? Was it trauma? Did they have their memories wiped somehow? I'd be more inclined to think that it was a combination of a couple of things. Probably a bit of trauma, definitely. You have to remember, a lot of the things that happened which were bad was when they were tucked away, which is like a nicer way of saying being groomed. But when they were in that state, they tended not to remember anything, so that's something to bear in mind. Also as well, how much do you remember from the age of 8? Do you know, like, do you remember a lot of things that happened to you? I mean, obviously Miles was 10, that is a little bit older. I do think key things like when Flora's been taken to the lake and nearly drowned, she was very much herself in that point. I mean, would you blank that out? Maybe as some kind of PTSD coping mechanism? Definitely. It could be that they've just wiped everything out. Also, their uncle as well grew up in that house, and he doesn't mention any ghosts. Maybe he did see them. You know, he mentioned seeing the ghost of a soldier, so maybe he's blanked all of that out too. So that would be my take on it. Although I would say, is telling this story with changing a couple of names wise in that circumstance? I mean, that could be a real trigger for the kids listening. It could really re-traumatize them, so I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea. Oh, and one last question, because this one was interesting. Uncle Henry, was his evil doppelganger a real ghost or a figment of his imagination? I think it was completely in his imagination. I know that this is based off of another work by the same author. I can't remember now, I'll put it up here if I remember. I think it was the title of the episode, where somebody is genuinely haunted by their evil doppelganger. For him, I think it was all in his imagination. You've got to remember that he feels a lot of guilt. The fact that he had an affair with his brother's wife meant that they took this trip to India and ended up dying while they were there. I know there were hints that maybe something else untoward went down, but I think that the evil doppelganger was essentially saying, it's your fault that the woman you love and your brother, who happens to be her husband, are dead. And he felt such guilt over that he didn't want to go to the manor. He realised that his biological daughter would never really know who he was. So I think that's a figment of his imagination, not necessarily a real ghost. And then 2 final points I want to leave on, which are just things I've thought about that are quite interesting. I think it's quite interesting to see that when a lot of the good main characters are tucked away, they've been tucked away in quite nice memories. Flora's with her parents, Miles is with his parents. You see, you know, love scenes being played out as well. Or with Hannah, Miss Gross, she's talking to Owen, who she's obviously very much in love with. But then when we see the bad characters who've been tucked away, when you have Peter, for example, he's replaying the same scene where he confronts his mum about his abuse. So for him, it's almost like he's in this kind of hell, whereas the other characters seem to be in their version of heaven, which I thought was quite interesting.
It's like I'm in hell.
And the last point I want to finish on, which I've not really seen anyone else talk about, but I thought was quite interesting. In the scenes where Peter is tucked away, he basically asks his mum, why did you let my dad abuse me? I'm guessing he means sexually abuse, and the mum doesn't give him any answer, and it's obviously a very traumatic, horrifying situation for him to be in. I thought then that it was quite interesting that him as a ghost, he was trying to then occupy the young body of Miles, almost in another alternate way of the victim abuser cycles, where the victim of abuse ends up becoming the abuser. So he was obviously sexually abused as a child and then went on to want to possess the body of a boy, often without him wanting to be possessed or even knowing he was being possessed. In one scene, Miles says, "I've told you to stop possessing me, you need to ask me like beforehand." So I thought that was quite an interesting thing to pick up on. So there are all my thoughts on Bly Manor. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below if you've seen it yet. If so, did you like it? How does it compare to The Haunting of Hill House for you? And I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again around these parts soon. Bye!